Time doesn't heal all wounds. Anyone who tells you that is selling you something where they've been lucky enough to never have a wound worth mentioning. Some wounds don't close. They just change. They become a part of your landscape, a permanent feature of your soul's geography. For 20 years, the center of my internal map has been a small, rectangular plot of earth in Oak Hill Cemetery, shaded by an old, weeping willow. And at the center of that plot is a simple, gray headstone. Michael Aaron Carter, beloved son, a light extinguished too soon. The dates beneath his name are the cruelest math I've ever known. A mere 7 years separated his first breath from his last. I visited that stone more times than I can count. It's my pilgrimage, my penance, my anchor. In the first year, I went every day, rain or shine, my body racked with sobs I could never seem to muster in front of my wife, Helen. She grieved in a different way, a quiet, inward collapse that left her bedridden for months. I grieved by standing sentinel. As the years bled into one another, the visits became weekly, then bi-weekly, but the ritual never lost its power. I'd go there on a Saturday morning, the way other men might go to a hardware store or a golf course. I'd clear away the fallen leaves, straighten the little weather-faded toy car we'd left there, a red Corvette he'd been obsessed with, and I'd talk to him. I'd tell him about my week, about the leaky faucet I'd finally fixed, about his mother, how she was doing. I'd update him on the world, on the new technologies and movies that would have blown his 7-year-old mind. It was a one-sided conversation, of course, but it was the only way I knew to keep him present, to keep the memory of his laugh, the exact blue of his eyes from fading. I was preserving a ghost, and that grave was my reliquary. The accident, it was a Tuesday, a bright, sunny autumn day, the kind that makes everything seem crisp and clean. He was playing in the front yard, chasing a squirrel. I just turned my back for a second, just a second, to grab the mail from the box. The sound, God, the sound is etched into me. It wasn't a loud crash. It was a sickening, soft thud. The squeal of brakes came a moment too late. I turned, and the world slowed to a crawl. The squirrel was chattering on a tree branch. The red Corvette was lying on its side in the grass. And my son, my Michael, was a small, still form on the asphalt. The official cause was a traumatic brain injury. He never woke up. For 3 days, we held vigil in a sterile, beige room that smelled of antiseptic and despair, until the machines told us the only story left to tell. The light was extinguished. For 20 years, I have carried the weight of that single, unforgivable second. The what if that follows a man like his own shadow? What if I had called him to me? What if I had checked the street first? What if I had been faster? That guilt became a part of my DNA, as fundamental as the color of my eyes. It was the fuel for my pilgrimages, the reason I kept talking to a slab of granite. It was my way of saying I was sorry over and over again to a boy who could no longer hear me. My life became a study in quiet endurance. Helen and I, we loved each other, but we were like two planets whose sun had gone out, orbiting a shared, cold darkness. We found a fragile peace, a routine, but the joy had been scooped out of us. Our house was clean, our bills were paid, but it was a museum dedicated to a life we no longer had. The ghost of our son lived in every room, in the silence at the dinner table, in the empty chair that we could never bring ourselves to move. And then, last month, the ghost decided to call. It was a Thursday. I remember because the garbage trucks were making their weekly racket outside. A sound so mundane, it was almost comforting. Helen was at her book club, a quiet gathering of women who discussed novels, but mostly just shared the small, quiet burdens of their lives. The house was still, filled with the dusty, afternoon light that seemed to highlight the stillness rather than disturb it. I was in the kitchen, methodically wiping down counters that were already clean, performing the small, mindless tasks that filled the empty spaces of my retirement. My phone was on the kitchen table, next to the fruit bowl that always held a few too many apples, slowly going soft. It was a modern smartphone, a gift from Helen who insisted I join the 21st century. But to me, it was just a utilitarian device for calls, texts, and the occasional weather check. Its ringtone was the standard, generic marimba chime that came preloaded. A harmless, everyday sound. Until it wasn't. When it began to play, my first reaction was a flicker of mild annoyance. A telemarketer? Probably. I finished wiping a spot near the sink, folded the cloth, and walked over to the table. I picked it up, my thumb moving to swipe the screen and send the unknown number to voicemail. And then I saw it. The name on the screen. The caller ID. It wasn't an unknown number. It wasn't a telemarketer. It wasn't Helen or a neighbor or my doctor's office. The name, displayed in crisp, white letters against the digital background, was Michael. The world did not slow down. It stopped. Completely. The sound of the garbage truck faded into a distant, muffled hum, as if someone had thrown a thick blanket over the entire neighborhood. The dust motes frozen in the sunbeam were now suspended in amber. My heart did not pound. It simply ceased to beat in my chest, a cold, dead weight. I could feel the blood draining from my face, a cold tingling spreading from my scalp down to my fingertips, which had gone numb around the cold glass of the phone. Michael. It was impossible. It was a glitch, a cruel joke, a nightmare. My mind, that reliable, logical organ that had processed 20 years of grief, short-circuited. It threw up a frantic, disjointed slideshow of explanations. A prank. A wrong number that had, by some astronomical fluke, been assigned his old number. A system error in the cellular network, a ghost in the machine. But the caller ID said Michael. Not a number. The contact. My contact. The one I had never, ever been able to delete. The one that had sat dormant in every phone I'd owned for 2 decades. A digital tombstone I carried in my pocket. The marimba ringtone continued to play. It was no longer a harmless chime. Each note was a shard of ice, a needle driving into my ear. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard, a screaming siren in the absolute silence of my frozen world. My thumb, which had been poised to swipe and reject the call, now trembled violently, hovering an inch above the screen. The green accept button glowed, a malevolent, tempting eye. Answer it, a desperate, insane part of my brain whispered. What if it's him? The rational part, the part that had visited a grave every other week for 20 years, fought back with cold, hard facts. He is dead. You buried him. You saw him in the casket. You held his cold, small hand. He's gone. But the name on the screen, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more deafening, more terrifying than the ringtone itself. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air out of the room. I stared at the screen, at the missed call notification, at the name Michael now listed above it. The phone felt like a live grenade in my hand. I half expected it to ring again, to prove I wasn't hallucinating. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath held, my entire body rigid. The mundane world began to seep back in. The garbage truck finished its route and moved on. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The clock on the wall ticked. Slowly, as if handling a sacred, or perhaps cursed, artifact, I opened the recent calls list. There it was, at the top. Michael, with the timestamp from 2 minutes ago. It was real. It had happened. A cold, sickening dread, entirely different from the warm, familiar ache of grief, began to pool in my stomach. This was not a memory. This was not a ghost from the past. This was a violation of the present. It was an active, malevolent force reaching out of the grave and into my kitchen. My son was buried, but his number had just called me. And in the profound, chilling silence of my home, I understood that the last 20 years of quiet endurance had just ended. Something new, something terrifying. The phone lay on the kitchen table where I had dropped it, a dormant black slab that now seemed to radiate a low, menacing energy. I couldn't touch it. I backed away, my chair scraping against the tile floor with a sound that was too loud, too violent in the suffocating quiet. My heart was no longer still. It was a frantic, caged animal trying to beat its way out of my chest. The rational explanations I had mustered now felt flimsy, pathetic lies I'd told myself to survive the initial shock. A wrong number wouldn't show his name. A telemarketer couldn't spoof a specific contact from my own address book. This was targeted. This was personal. For an hour, I did not move from that spot, standing sentinel over the device as if it were a bomb that might detonate at any second. My eyes were fixed on the screen, waiting, dreading for it to light up again. Every nerve ending was raw, hyper-aware. The hum of the refrigerator was a roar. The settling of the house was a footstep. I was a man waiting for a ghost to call back. And then it did. The marimba ringtone sliced through the silence again, a cheerful, digital sound that was now the soundtrack to my personal hell. The name Michael blazed on the screen. This time, there was no hesitation born of shock. There was only a terrible, compelling need. I had to know. I had to hear. Whether it was a demon, a dream, or some impossible miracle, I could not live in this limbo of not knowing. My hand, steadier than I expected, reached out and picked up the phone. My thumb, cold and numb, hovered over the green button. I took a breath that felt like my first, and I accepted the call. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the hollow static of an open line. My entire being was focused on that small, plastic speaker, waiting for the voice from the other side. And then it came. "Hello. Is anyone there?" It was a young man's voice. Hesitant, a little rough around the edges, maybe in his early 20s. It was not the high, clear voice of a 7-year-old boy. Of course it wasn't. My mind knew that. But my heart, my treacherous, hopeful heart, had still, for one impossible second, expected it to be. The disconnect was jarring, a fresh wave of grief and confusion. I found my voice, but it was a stranger's, a dry, cracked whisper. "Who is this?" There was a pause on the other end. I could hear background noise now, the faint sound of traffic, the distant wail of a siren. A city sound. Our town was quiet. I think I have the wrong number. Sorry to bother you." It was a perfectly normal thing to say, a perfectly normal reaction, but it was attached to the most abnormal of circumstances. This normalcy, coming from that number, was an abomination. "Wait," I said, the word sharp, desperate. "What number are you trying to call?" He recited it. My son's old number. The one we'd had disconnected, the one that should have been retired, buried, and forgotten along with him 20 years ago. The number that was, for all intents and purposes, dead. "That's this number," I said, my voice trembling. "But this number, it hasn't been in use for 20 years. Who are you?" The pause this time was longer, heavier. I could almost feel his confusion through the line. "What? No, that can't be right. I just got this phone." "Well, not just. A few months ago, the carrier gave me this number. A new customer. A recycle number." It was the most logical explanation, the one I should have grasped immediately. The cellular company had, after a sufficient period of dormancy, taken my dead son's number and assigned it to a new, living person. It was a simple, bureaucratic act, a clerical reassignment of digits. It made perfect sense, but it didn't feel logical. It felt like a violation. It felt like someone had exhumed a coffin and given his clothes to a stranger. This young man, with his casual apology and his city sounds, was now wearing my son's digital skin. Every time his phone rang, it was an echo from my boy's grave. Every text he received was a message that should have been lost to time. "I see," I said, the fight going out of me, replaced by a profound, weary emptiness. "A recycle number." "Yeah, guess so," the young man said, his voice brighter now, the awkwardness passing. "Sorry again for bothering you. Have a good one." "Wait," I said again, the desperation returning. Your name. What's your name?" Another pause, a slight wariness now. It's Aaron." "What? Aaron? A common name. A normal name. Not Michael. Of course not Michael." The finality of it was a physical blow. There was no miracle, no misteri, just a cold, corporate coincidence. "No reason," I whispered, the weight of 20 years crashing back down upon me, heavier than ever. "No reason at all. Goodbye, Aaron." I ended the call before he could respond. I placed the phone back on the table, the screen now dark. It was over. The ghost was just a kid named Aaron who'd been assigned a dead boy's digits. I should have felt relief. I should have felt closure. But as I stood there in my silent kitchen, the ghost of my son's voice replaced by the voice of a stranger named Aaron, I felt neither. I felt a new, different kind of loss. The phone call hadn't brought him back. It had only buried him all over again. The sound of Helen's key in the front door was usually a soft, welcome signal of the day's gentle end. Tonight, it was the click of a starting pistol. I was still standing in the kitchen, the phone a dark scar on the table, the air still thick with the phantom echoes of that voice, Aaron's voice. In the hours since the call, I had tried to reassemble myself, to dust off the rational man I'd been for 60-odd years and put him back in the driver's seat. I'd made tea I didn't drink. I'd straightened the magnets on the fridge. I performed the pantomime of normalcy, but it was a hollow performance. The kitchen no longer felt like the heart of our home. It felt like a crime scene. "John, I'm home," Helen called out, her voice light, carrying the residual warmth of friendship and Chardonnay. I forced my muscles to move, to walk from the kitchen to the front hall, to arrange my face into what I hoped was a placid, welcoming mask. In here, she was taking off her coat, hanging it neatly in the closet. She turned, and her smile, which had started to fade into the gentle fatigue of the evening, froze on her face. Her eyes, the same keen, perceptive eyes that had seen me through joy and the very depths of despair, narrowed just a fraction. "John, what's wrong? You're white as a sheet." And there it was, the moment. The chasm opening between the truth of my afternoon and the life we had built together. For 20 years, our marriage had been a fortress built on a shared, terrible loss. The walls were made of mutual understanding. The foundation was our collective grief. We didn't talk about Michael constantly, but his absence was the third presence in every room, a silence we both respected. We had never lied to each other about him. His memory was the one thing that was sacred, inviolable. But as I looked at her, at the concern etching itself into the fine lines around her eyes, I knew I could not tell her about the phone call. I could not lay this new, bizarre, and ultimately pointless agony on her shoulders. The story of the call led nowhere good. It led to a dead end named Aaron. To tell her would be to rip open the carefully healed scar of our loss for no reason other than to share the pain. It would be an act of cruelty, not of communion. She had finally found a fragile piece. I would not be the one to shatter it. So I did something I had never done before. I looked my wife in the eye, and I told her a deliberate, calculated lie about our son. "It's nothing, honey," I said, and I was shocked at how normal my voice sounded. It was flat, a little tired, perfectly believable. Just a long day. Feeling a bit under the weather. That's all. Probably a touch of stomach bug. I even mustered a weak, dismissive wave of my hand. Her gaze held mine for a moment longer, searching. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. Could she see the seismic fault line running through me? Could she hear the echo of that marimba ringtone still vibrating in the air? I held my breath. Then, her expression softened. She believed me. She stepped forward and pressed the back of her hand to my forehead, a gesture so wifely, so familiar, it made my heart ache with the weight of the deception. "You do feel a bit clammy. You should go lie down. I'll bring you some ginger ale." "I will," I said, the lie now coiling comfortably in my gut, a new, permanent resident. "How was book club?" As she talked, chattering about the novel they'd barely discussed and the various life updates of the other women, I nodded and made the appropriate noises. But I was a ghost in my own hallway. The lie had created a barrier between us, a thin, transparent film that she couldn't see, but that I could feel with every breath. I had exiled myself. Later, as we lay in bed in the dark, back to back, as was our custom, the silence felt different. It was no longer a shared, comfortable quiet. It was a silence filled with my secret. I stared at the digital clock on my nightstand, its red numbers burning into my retinas. 11:47 p.m. I could hear her steady, even breathing, and I was consumed by a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. For 20 years, we had borne this grief together. Now I was bearing this new, strange torment alone. The phone call had been a shock, but this, the lie, felt like a betrayal. I had protected her, yes, but in doing so, I had broken the most sacred rule of our survival. I had taken the one thing we truly shared and made it mine alone. The ghost of our son was no longer just a memory we both visited. He was now a secret I kept, And in the heavy darkness of our bedroom, I knew that some wounds don't just change you. They isolate you. This one had just built a wall right down the center of our bed. The lie festered. It was a low-grade infection in my soul, making every interaction with Helen feel brittle and false. My performance of normalcy was a tight, constricting suit I had to put on every morning. How did you sleep, dear? Fine. Lie. Are you feeling better? Much, thank you. Lie. The simple, domestic exchanges that were the mortar of our marriage now felt like interrogations. I was a spy in my own home, and the classified information was a phone call from a ghost. Aaron's voice, his casual explanation, it should have been the end of it. A closed case. A bizarre, painful coincidence to be filed away and forgotten. But it wasn't. The logical part of my brain had accepted the story. The rest of me, the father, the griever, the man who had lived for 2 decades with a phantom limb where his son should have been, rebelled. A recycled number? It was too clean, too easy. It felt like a cover story, a pat answer designed to make a nuisance go away. There was a dissonance that grated on me, a detail that didn't fit. The sheer, visceral terror of that first ring. The way the name Michael had blazed on the screen. That wasn't just a wrong number, it was a message. And the fact that it was my contact from my phone that made it personal. A newly assigned number wouldn't just populate an old, dormant contact in my address book. That wasn't how it worked. That meant the call had come from a device that was, or had once been, associated with that contact. The ghost wasn't just in the number, it was in my own digital records. I had to know. The not knowing was a worse torture than any truth could possibly be. So I began to dig. Quietly. Methodically. This was my secret to bear, and my investigation would be mine alone. It started in the attic. I told Helen I was finally going to sort through the old Christmas decorations, a task she'd been gently suggesting for years. She seemed pleased, a flicker of the old, shared project warmth in her eyes that only deepened my guilt. The attic was a time capsule, hot and thick with dust, filled with the physical artifacts of the life we'd lost. Boxes of baby clothes, tiny sneakers, a faded poster of a cartoon character I could no longer name. I ignored them all, my heart a drum in my chest. I was looking for a specific cardboard box, labeled in my own, younger handwriting, impersonal. I found it tucked behind Helen's old wedding dress, which was sealed in a plastic bag like a relic. I carried the box to the dim circle of light beneath the bare bulb, the dust motes swirling around me like agitated spirits. Inside, there was no lingering scent of childhood, just the smell of old paper, report cards, finger paintings, and there, at the bottom, a manila folder. His life on paper. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. His birth certificate, a lock of blonde hair in a tiny Ziploc bag, and his social security card, the little 9-digit number that had officially, bureaucratically, represented his existence. I stared at it, this string of numbers that had been issued to a baby and retired for a child. This was the key. This number was the tether between the boy I remembered and the ghost in the machine. Back in the sterile light of my home office, with the door locked, I became a detective of the dead. I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my face in the darkened room. I started with the basic public searches. I typed his full name, his date of birth, his date of death. The results were what I expected: a digitized obituary from our local paper, a listing on a genealogy site. The digital footprint of a life that ended before the internet truly began. He was a whisper in the data streams, a footnote. Then, I did something I knew was crossing a line. I went onto one of those people search websites, the shady ones that promise to unveil anyone's secrets for a fee. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This felt like a violation, not just of privacy, but of memory. Was I desecrating his grave with this digital shovel? I took a breath, and I entered his information. Name: Michael Aaron Carter. Last known address: the one on his death certificate. The site spun its wheels, a progress bar filling with agonizing slowness. And then, the results appeared. My blood ran cold. There he was. Or, rather, there his identity was, listed as a possible match. But the details were wrong. Horribly, impossibly wrong. According to this site, Michael Aaron Carter had a credit profile that had been active within the last 5 years. There were addresses associated with him, a P.O. box in a city 2 states over, an apartment in a neighboring town. There were utility hookups, a driver's license number. It was all there. A shadow life, a paper trail for a ghost. The recycled phone number wasn't a coincidence. It was a single thread I had pulled on, and now the entire tapestry of his death was beginning to unravel. The ground beneath my feet, the solid, unshakable truth of the last 20 years, that my son was in the ground, was no longer solid. It was quicksand, and I was sinking. The digital ghost I had unearthed was a more terrifying specter than any phantom voice on the phone. A recycle number was a mistake. A active credit profile was an abomination. It meant someone, somewhere, was breathing life into his name, walking around in the skin of my dead son. The grief, which had been a heavy, constant stone in my chest, was now a swirling vortex of confusion, anger, and a terrifying, forbidden sliver of hope. What if by some miracle? No. I crushed the thought before it could fully form. I had seen his body. I had held a cold hand. That hope was a path to madness. The People Search site offered scant details, but it gave me a location, the neighboring town of Crestwood, a 40-minute drive away. It listed a recent address, an apartment complex, but my gut told me that was a dead end. A ghost wouldn't be so easily found. But the site also listed a place of employment, a generic listing for a 24-hour diner called The Skillet on a highway service road. It was the kind of place that paid in cash, asked few questions, and had a high turnover. A perfect place for a shadow to hide in plain sight. I told Helen I was meeting an old work friend for a late breakfast, a lie that now came to my lips with a disturbing ease. The drive to Crestwood was a blur. My hands were clenched on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Every mile that passed felt like a step deeper into a forbidden world, a trespass against the memory of the son I had buried. The Skillet was exactly as I had pictured it. A long, low-slung building with neon signs flickering weakly in the morning sun, nestled between a truck wash and a budget motel. The air smelled of grease, coffee, and diesel fuel. I parked at the far end of the lot, my heart hammering against my ribs. What was my plan? To walk in and ask for Michael? To describe a 7-year-old boy to a waitress? I sat there for what felt like an hour, watching the comings and goings through the large plate glass window. Truckers, a family with tired-looking children, a few solitary men hunched over mugs of coffee. I studied every face, every build, searching for a trace of my son, for some flicker of recognition in a stranger's features. It was futile. I was looking for a ghost. Finally, the fear of not knowing overpowered the fear of the truth. I got out of the car and walked inside. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound at odds with my grim purpose. The air was thick and warm. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read Flo nodded at me from behind the counter. "Sit anywhere, honey." I took a booth in the corner with a clear view of the entire restaurant. My mouth was dry. I ordered a coffee I didn't want from a bored-looking young waiter, my eyes constantly scanning. And then I saw him. He was bussing a table near the back, his back to me. A young man, probably in his mid-20s. He had a lean build, dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans. There was nothing remarkable about him. But when he turned, carrying a tub of dirty dishes, I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent rush. He had my eyes. It was an unmistakable genetic echo. The same shade of blue, the same slight downturn at the corners. He had my father's jawline, a feature I'd always been told Michael would grow into. His hair was a darker brown than Michael's had been, but the cowlick at the front was the same stubborn one I tried to tame every morning before school. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a trick of the light, my desperate mind projecting features onto a random stranger. But the resemblance was uncanny, a living photograph of what my son might have looked like had he lived. I felt dizzy, the diner tilting around me. This wasn't a ghost in a machine. This was a ghost in the flesh. I watched him, mesmerized and horrified. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his expression neutral, almost blank. He didn't smile. He didn't interact with the other staff. He was a satellite, orbiting the noisy diner in his own quiet sphere. Was this him? Had some miracle occurred? Had he been taken, not killed? Was the small, broken body we buried someone else's child? The questions were a torrent, threatening to sweep me away. He disappeared into the kitchen, and I sat there, paralyzed. My coffee grew cold. The rational part of my brain fought a losing battle against the tidal wave of impossible hope. I had to know. I had to hear his voice again, see his face up close. When he emerged again, wiping his hands on a rag, I made my move. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked toward him as he was clearing a newly vacated table. My heart was a wild thing in my chest. He looked up as I approached, his blue eyes, my eyes, meeting mine. There was no recognition in them, just the polite, vacant look of a service worker. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked. And there it was, the voice. It was slightly deeper than it had been on the phone, but it was the same. It was Aaron. The young man from the phone call was standing in front of me, wearing the face of my dead son. The world narrowed to this single, impossible point. The diner noise faded. I was looking at a living, breathing person who shared my DNA, who bore the name of my dead child, and who called himself Aaron. The truth was not a simple story of identity theft. It was something far more complex, far more terrifying. I was not looking for a ghost. I was looking at a stranger wearing my son's face. "Sir," he repeated, a flicker of concern in his familiar eyes. My voice failed me. I shook my head, a helpless, pathetic gesture. No, thank you." I turned and walked out of the diner, leaving my untouched coffee and a $20 bill on the table. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had found the man at the diner. And in doing so, I had lost any remaining semblance of the world I thought I knew. The drive home from Crestwood was a white-knuckle nightmare. The familiar highway was an alien ribbon, the other cars mere blurs. My mind was a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a different, terrifying possibility. The young man's face, my father's jaw, was burned onto the back of my eyelids. The voice from the phone was now attached to a living, breathing person who moved through the world with my son's stolen features. This was no longer a mystery of numbers and data. This was a doppelganger, a changeling, a violation of nature itself. I couldn't go home. I couldn't face Helen, not with this seismic truth screaming inside my skull. I pulled into the deserted parking lot of the local library, the engine ticking as it cooled. I sat there, my forehead pressed against the steering wheel, and I tried to think. The rational world had offered me its explanation, a recycled number, a case of identity theft, and I had rejected it. Now, I was adrift in a sea of the impossible. The answer, if there was one, would not be found in a diner or on a shady website. It would be in the place where the story had officially ended, the place where the final, terrible period had been put on my son's life. St. Jude's Hospital. It took me 3 days to muster the courage. 3 days of living as a ghost in my own home, jumping at every notification on my phone, seeing the young man's face in my dreams. I told Helen I had a series of doctor's appointments, a general checkup, a follow-up on my knee. The lies were piling up, creating a secret second life of my own, a parallel existence of obsession and dread. Walking through the automatic doors of St. Jude's was like stepping back in time. The smell was the same, antiseptic and floor wax with an undercurrent of human anxiety. The lobby had been renovated, brighter and more modern, but the essence of the place was unchanged. This was the building where my world had ended. I went to the medical records department. The woman behind the glass partition was young, efficient, uninterested. I slid my driver's license and a completed request form onto the glass. I was requesting a copy of my son's full medical record from the day of the accident. My hand trembled as I pushed it through. "Reason for request?" she asked, not looking up. "Estate matters," I said, the lie smooth and cold on my tongue. It was a phrase I'd rehearsed, vague enough to be plausible. She took the documents and told me it would be 20 minutes. I sat on a hard, plastic chair in the waiting area, surrounded by sick people and their worried families. I felt like an imposter. I wasn't here for closure or for a second opinion. I was here to exhume the past with a bureaucratic shovel. When she called my name, She handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope. It felt heavy, dense with secrets. I took it to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the ignition. I didn't drive away. I just sat there in the hospital parking lot, the envelope lying on the passenger seat like a sleeping serpent. Finally, I tore it open. The first pages were what I expected. The ambulance report, the admission forms, the frantic clinical notes from the ER. Pedestrian versus automobile. Unresponsive. GCS-3. I skimmed them, the professional jargon unable to mask the raw horror of that day. Then, I found the neurosurgical reports, the CT scans. The language was cold, precise. Massive intracranial hemorrhage. Irreversible brain stem injury. My eyes scanned the pages, my heart a dull, aching weight. And then I saw it. A single line, buried in the pre-operative checklist for the organ donation procedure we had authorized in our grief-stricken stupor. A procedure we had agreed to because we wanted some sliver of good to come from the unimaginable evil. Organ procurement. Heart. Recipient. Male infant 11 Mohs, status 1A. Procedure code 33945. We had donated his heart. In the fog of our grief, it had seemed like a noble, beautiful thing. A part of our son, living on, saving another family from our fate. We had signed the papers. We had held on to that single, fragile hope. I kept reading, my breath catching in my throat. The records were meticulous. The transplant team, the time of extraction, the time of terminal extubation. The time didn't match. According to the records Helen and I had received, the time of death was listed as 4:17 p.m. We had been there. We had kissed his forehead after the machines were silent. But this internal record, the surgical log, listed the time of the organ procurement procedure as beginning at 3:45 p.m. A 32-minute discrepancy. My mind, reeling, tried to find a reason. A clerical error. A time zone confusion. But this was a hospital record. It was precise. It was timed to the second. And then the final piece of the puzzle fell into place with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the heart. There was another entry, one I had missed in my first grief-blurred reading of the documents 20 years ago. A secondary, concurrent procedure, authorized under a different, more obscure protocol. Tissue harvest, saphenous vein segment. 4R and D. Pediatric vascular graft study. Protocol #PX 8892. They had taken a vein, a small, seemingly insignificant blood vessel. For research, the truth, the terrible, monstrous truth, finally revealed itself to me in that sunlit car. It wasn't just his heart that had lived on. A part of him, a tiny, living piece of tissue, a cluster of cells that held his unique, miraculous genetic code, had been taken, cultured, grown. The young man at the diner wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a stolen identity. He was a product, a living, breathing product of unauthorized, monstrous research. A chimera created from my son's stolen DNA. He wasn't my son. He was his shadow, his echo, a testament to a science I could barely comprehend. He had my eyes because, on a fundamental level, he was built for my son's blueprint. The file slipped from my numb fingers, spilling its terrible secrets onto the floor mat. I had gone looking for a ghost. I had found something infinitely worse. I had found the truth in a hospital file, and it was more horrifying than any lie. The world outside the car window had not changed. The sun still shone on the hospital's manicured lawn. Cars still came and went, carrying their burdens of hope and fear. But the man inside the car was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell filled with a knowledge so corrosive it felt like it was eating me from the inside out. The truth was not a liberation. It was a life sentence. My son had not just died. He had been mined. His biological essence had been taken, without our true, informed consent, and used as raw material. The young man at the diner, Aaron, was not a miracle. He was a crime scene. I drove home on autopilot. The familiar streets, now looking like a film set, a flimsy fabrication over a terrifying reality. Helen was in the garden, kneeling by her rose bushes, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face. She looked up and smiled as I approached, her face smudged with earth. It was a picture of such profound, simple normalcy that it felt like a physical assault. "How were your appointments, dear?" she asked, her voice warm and untroubled. The lies I had told were now a fortress wall between us. Behind that wall was a jungle of horrors, a cloned son, a living ghost, a betrayal by the very institutions meant to heal. To tear that wall down now would be to destroy her. It would shatter the fragile peace she had spent 20 years building. She had accepted the grave. She had made her peace with God, with the universe, with the cruel, random accident. How could I tell her that the accident was only the beginning of the horror? That the noble act of donation we had clung to as a single point of light in our darkness had been perverted into something monstrous? I looked at her, at the simple, trusting love in her eyes, and I knew I could not tell her. This burden was mine to carry alone. To share it would be an act of unforgivable violence. "Everything's fine," I said, my voice a stranger's. "Just the usual. Getting old." It was the last lie, and it would have to last a lifetime. That night, I lay awake again, but the silence was different. The frantic, searching terror was gone, replaced by a cold, grim resolution. The question was no longer what happened. The question was, what now? I had a choice. I could go to the authorities. I could take the hospital records, my story, the evidence of the living young man who shared my DNA, and I could unleash hell. There would be investigations, scandals, lawsuits. It would be a righteous firestorm. It would expose the truth. It would perhaps bring some form of justice, or at least acknowledgement for the violation committed against my son, against our family. And it would destroy Aaron. What was he? A victim, just as much as we were. A product of a hidden, unethical science, created and cast into the world with no knowledge of his own origins. He was living his life, a difficult, seemingly lonely life, working in a diner, unaware that he was the central figure in a tragedy that began 2 decades before he was even decanted. To expose the truth would be to tear his identity out from under him. It would make him a spectacle, a laboratory experiment to be poked and prodded by the media and the legal system. He would never know a moment's peace again. He had my son's eyes. Could I condemn those eyes to a life of such torment? Or I could do nothing. I could bury the truth deeper than we had buried Michael. I could let the world continue to spin in its ignorant bliss. Helen would live out her days in the peace she had earned. Aaron would continue his life, in whatever shape it took, free from the burden of his own impossible origin story. It was a choice between justice for the dead and peace for the living, between a truth that would destroy everyone it touched and a lie that would allow 2 broken people, my wife and this unknowing shadow of my son, to continue their lives. As the first hints of dawn painted the horizon, I made my choice. I got out of bed quietly. I went to my study, and I took the thick hospital file, along with every note I had made, every printout from the People's Search site. I carried them down to the basement to the old cast-iron sink I used for washing paintbrushes. I struck a match. The paper caught quickly, the flames hungry and orange. I watched as the truth curled and blackened, turning into fragile, weightless ash. The words protocol #PX 8892 glowed for a moment before crumbling into nothing. I burned it all, every last piece. I was cremating the evidence, performing a second funeral for my son, this time for his stolen legacy. I am a father. My job is to protect my children. One of my children is in the ground, beyond any earthly protection. The other is a stranger who shares his face, a living boy who calls himself Aaron, who has never known a father's love. My choice is not noble. It is not right. It is a choice made in the dark between 2 terrible paths. I have chosen to let the ghost rest. I have chosen to let the shadow live in peace. I will carry this secret to my own grave. And some Saturday mornings, I will still visit the cemetery and I will talk to my son. But now, I will have a new thing to tell him. I will tell him about his brother, and I will ask him if I have chosen wisely. The stone never answers, but the wind in the willow tree sounds almost like a sigh.